I'm just going to mute all of us until we start.
Okay.
And I'll probably take myself off video too for the time being. Hi, and welcome to the next or the latest Oculus webinar, Veterinary Resilience Guide. I'm really happy to be able to present this along with Whitney Hischier. Whitney has been a long-time friend of Oculus. She has taught at many of our courses in throughout America, Europe. Whitney is a lecturer, and she's doing a dance. Whitney's a lecturer at the University of California at Berkeley. She teaches at the MBA program on entrepreneurship. So Whitney, welcome, and thank you for being part of the Oculus Veterinary Resilience Guide. Oh, I gotta unmute people. Hold on one second. Sorry, I had you muted. So
no problem. Can you hear me now?
Now you're back.
Okay. Well, hello everyone and welcome. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I realize that the timing is a bit late, especially for those calling in from Europe. So I'm thrilled to join this series. I think this is such an important topic. And as Mike mentioned, I've had the opportunity to work with Oculus for a number of years on some MBA type trainings around entrepreneurship and strategy, two areas I work in. I am what you might call a veterinary super user. I have multiple species, including 2 Ridgebacks, a cat, and 3 horses, one who is probably going to foal any day now. So it's in my best interest to keep you guys resilient with sustainable businesses that are hopefully profitable irrespective of the conditions in the market. So as we get started, Mike, do you want to say a few words about the Veterinary Resilience Guide?
Yeah, so the Veterinary Resilience Guide is something we've put together for veterinarians as we're all trying to navigate through the COVID-19 crisis that we're all facing. No matter where you're at, we're all being affected. So we have put together, there's a link, and we will make sure that you get a copy of this link too after this webinar, where we have our weekly webinars where you can register for the upcoming ones. We're doing a webinar every Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern on various subjects. We also have our blogs. We're doing twice a week podcasts. One was just released yesterday with Sue Armstrong from Oculus on coaching. We'll be doing another one being released on Thursday on just HR, human resource practices. It's just everything that as a veterinary practice, as you're needing tools to help you navigate through this, it will be in this resilience guide. So it's a special thing that we have created. I also just want to mention before we start jumping into your presentation, Whitney, that there's a couple of things that we can use here. So as attendees here, I can allow anybody to speak. So if you want to ask a question, we want to be a little bit more interactive. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button that you can, if you have a question, you can post it there. What we'd like everybody to do is go to the chat button and just sort of tell us what country you're from. Maybe with that chat button, what country you're from, but also what is your biggest challenge right now with the COVID-19, because that'll give us some ideas on next subjects for next webinars. And also, we're going to do some polls. And so they're anonymous polls, so you don't have to worry about us knowing anything about you. But there's 3 polls we'll do during this presentation just to get a better sense of how people are doing right now. And then, of course, this is being recorded. And after we're done, we'll be posting it. So if there's anything you missed on it, you can always go back to the recording and listen in. So I'm going to pass it back over to you, Whitney.
Great. Thanks a lot, Mike. So today's topic is around decision making and what is frequently used as a term called VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. This is a term that comes from the military. And as we've seen in the last few weeks and months, the world is not probably going to get less VUCA, but more. So one of the chronic challenges that I work with, both students as well as executives running companies and small business owners, is how do you make decisions, both longer term and shorter term, when the future is very uncertain and may not look like the past? We don't have the ability to rely on historic data to make decisions about the future because it just may be irrelevant, and particularly in environments that we can't control. So what we're going to look at today is knowing that there are many meta level factors going on that will impact your businesses. How can you best plan for them? How can you best gather intelligence from the environment to essentially stay attuned to shifts as they happen? And how can you be more flexible in managing your practice to meet those challenges? Mike, maybe I'll stop here just for a moment if you don't mind sharing on the chat anything that's come in so far in terms of challenges or locations.
Yeah, no, it's we're just getting our locations in, and some of these are just in general subjects that I think would be really important for the next set of webinars or podcasts or what have you. So we're good to carry on.
Okay, very good. So what we're going to talk about today are three sort of key bucket areas. One is strategy. So what is your strategy or plan for your practice? The second are around biases and assumptions. So these are just natural human tendencies for how we both see the world, but then use that lens of how we see the world to make decisions, and sometimes not the best ones. And then I'll talk through three different tools that you can use to counter these biases and assumptions that are fairly simple and somewhat deceptively simple. But we'll also be sharing with you some templates afterwards that you can go back and try to do these with your team. So I want to just jump in here around strategy and also do a quick poll. Strategy is one of those words a bit like innovation that if you're in the business world, it gets thrown around a lot and often doesn't really mean anything. And I think strategy is often what you choose to do, as well as more specifically what you choose not to do. All of you run small businesses that have probably very stretched resources, whether it's people, time, equipment. And so you can't do everything. You can't be everything to everyone. And so you need to have a very clear picture of who it is you're serving as your customer, what it is you're trying to achieve in terms of growth or stasis with the business, and what are you going to opt to do as well as not to do in order to make your business sustainable. So with that, Mike, why don't we launch the first poll? And what we're curious to hear about is how many of you actually have a written strategy or plan in place for your practice for the next 12 to 18 months.
Yeah, so I'll just let this up for about 15 seconds. This is the first time we've used this polling, so looks like it's working here.
Great.
So I'll give it another 10 seconds there. So I recommend everybody just at the bottom of the screen where it says, it should be popped up in front of you.
Yeah, I'm able to see it here.
All right. All right, so we have half the people, it's really split down the middle, 50-50 in terms of who has a strategy and who doesn't.
Yeah, great. And thank you for sharing that. And this is not unusual. I think for some practices, particularly smaller practices, the information or the plan might be in your head, but not necessarily written down, either due to lack of time or just feeling like, I think, if I understand it, everyone else around me probably should. We'll talk a little more about this, but in many cases, even if it's very, very simple, it's quite helpful to have something written down. And for two reasons. One is a communication tool with your team, so you don't have to solve all these problems yourself as you're facing new challenges on a daily basis with the current environment. The second is if you indeed need to get to a point of getting help with financing, either from the bank with a small business loan, through some type of government grant, if your government's offering that, they will most likely request to see something about your projected plans versus actual, not just the numbers themselves. And so having something that you can refer to is quite helpful, just to quickly communicate your business and where you're off and the gap that you need to fill.
Whitney, we have a question in. Somebody has asked with regards to the poll, is 12 to 18 months a reasonable timeline? Should it not be much shorter?
So that's a great question. I would say 12 to 18 months is pretty standard, but it's a dynamic document. So most businesses look to annual revenue profit goals in terms of, that's the overall kind of projected time frame. And then you will often break that down by a monthly, quarterly basis. Just putting those goals or plans into place for 12 to 18 months doesn't mean they stay that way. They often, especially with the current changes with the pandemic, may require being modified on the go. But I think, in my view, it's best practice to have both that longer term view and then be modifying on the short term versus just focusing month to month, because you end up making different decisions with a very short term view. And it's easy to get into more of a survival mode than a longer term, well, we're down this month, but we have next month. We're still planning ahead. Mike, do you want to add to that on timing?
Yeah, I usually start with a 3-year goal and work backwards, as you said, more of what are we doing next year, and this season perhaps. But sometimes if you have a substantial shift in your strategy, it may take 2 or 3 years for it to be fully implemented. Not everything can be done in one season, so I'm more of the 3 years working back.
Yeah, in particular for the case for many of you that may be investing in major capital equipment, where it's going to take a while to either get the money to purchase that, or you're building an additional facility or wing. Those things don't happen overnight. So working towards those on a multi-year basis is good. And we'll share with you the scenario planning tool we have here usually goes into a 5-year forecast, just to think, more of a stretch ahead, which is particularly relevant for some of you that may be thinking about selling your practices within a certain time frame, if you're close to retirement or thinking about a career shift, or just looking to sort of modify how you're spending your professional time.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, right. So what we want to focus on for these kind of the rest of these exercises are ways not to further reinforce what you know and can control, but adapt to what you don't know and what you don't control. And I think this resonates pretty strongly with what we've been seeing in the news, and just the fact that nobody can really tell us when the pandemic will end, what's the best way to manage it, and who and what's going to come out ahead. So this is a slide that I often use when I'm teaching scenario planning. And this last one was actually working with a meat producer in China, as they've had a swine flu epidemic, but I probably could put pangolins and bats in there now. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Daniel Kahneman, but Daniel Kahneman is a psychologist who has created a groundbreaking area of work around biases and assumptions. He has a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which is quite thick and a little dry to get through, but I highly recommend it if you're interested in this area. Michael Lewis, the business writer, also wrote another book about Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, his research partner, that's a little bit of an easier read. But the point is that Daniel Kahneman was the first psychologist for the Israeli army. And he watched how soldiers behaved and realized there were a lot of inconsistencies. Basically, Adam Smith, who said all human behavior is rational, was wrong. And what he realized is that the way our mind works is not as typical as we think, and that we often are responding to the world in ways that rely more on our quick impressions versus deep analytical thought. And how he divided this up were 2 systems of thinking. One is system 1, which is automatic. And this is where most of us live, particularly in times of high stress, crisis, or just fast paced. It's automatic. It's where we just basically quickly jump to conclusions. I've done this procedure before. I see the animal. I know exactly what to do. Or there's a roadblock ahead. I don't need to think about how I'll maneuver the car. I just quickly swerve. System 2 takes more effort, is slower, and far more deliberate. And system 2 is when we take a step back and say, do I really have all the information? Am I processing this based on any assumptions that may be faulty? Is this truly the most effective way to do things? System 1 is slow, it's hard, and most of us simply just don't have time for it. The tools I'm going to show you are specifically system 2 tools. And it's not to say to live in that world all the time, but to really be effective in planning, we need to take a step back and fall more into the system 2 category. I'm not going to show this clip because Zoom doesn't do sound particularly well on video. But if you have the opportunity to watch the Chernobyl miniseries that was done by HBO, there's an excellent scene in this very first episode where basically there's an explosion. And a junior scientist runs into the control room and says to the senior scientist, there's been an explosion. And the senior scientist says, yes, yes, of course, we all have felt the building shake, we know. And the junior scientist says, yes, but the core has exploded. And the senior scientist says, he's in shock, get him out of here. He doesn't know what he's talking about. That's scientifically impossible. That senior scientist later walks out of the control room and sees the actual graphite pieces of the core on the ground, but is still in denial. And I think it's a beautiful example of how we are so focused on how we want to see the world often that even when presented with actual evidence, we may question its viability because it doesn't fit into our framework. What we learn later is that the Russian, then the Soviet government, had hidden scientific studies that indicated this could happen. They were worried it was because they were basically bankrupt and cutting corners when it came to many things, including their nuclear facilities. So by hiding the evidence and claiming it couldn't happen, they just prayed for the best and hoped it didn't. And there's a number of different cognitive biases that some you may be very familiar with, some not. Groupthink is one where, of course, everybody in an organization or your practice will agree or tend to always approve maybe what the most senior person says. This is often also seen as like a bandwagon effect. One person says something and everybody else follows. Status quo bias, this is the way things normally are, so of course they will be in the future. Belief bias, I see this a lot with our entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. If I believe in something hard enough, it will happen. And as my horse trainer likes to say, hoping and praying is not a strategy. Anchoring effect, you'll see this a lot in things like advertising and marketing or negotiations, where you provide either a really high or a really low number, where you set expectations and the counterparty is just relieved when they're able to move a little bit above or below those. So the one I want to sort of focus on the most here, and we'll talk a bit more in the rest of the session today, is in the bottom right on confirmation bias. And what confirmation bias really is approving information you receive that fits with your view of the world and ignoring that which doesn't. And in the last election in the US, this was a big deal in terms of Facebook and implications for their enabling these types of echo chambers on social media to reinforce views or perspectives on news that people wanted to believe versus allowing for countering viewpoints. And one of the things that we find is the busier people get, the more frenetic their lives, the more stressed they get, the more they fall back on confirmation bias. And it's something all of us do, but you may see it with your own clients. You may see it with your team. And so I'll share with you some tools here that you can use to work against that. Mike, I'll just take a pause here to see if anything's come through on the chat or the questions that we might want to address before moving on.
Nothing right so far.
Okay, great. So one of the the things in terms of countering biases and assumptions is the ability to both frame and reframe problems and opportunities, to think about them differently in order to find solutions, because what previously worked as a solution may not. So an example in the simplest form here is a reframe of a traditional vacuum. I appreciate it's a Dyson, but on the left is a traditional stand-up vacuum, and on the right is an iRobot or a Roomba. And the classic vacuum worked on an assumption that a human being had to be attached to it, which is sort of silly because if you think about why, most humans don't like to vacuum. There's always the rare few that find it really satisfying and gives them an element of control in their lives. But for most people, it's loud, it's noisy, it's heavy, it's time they would rather be spending doing something else. And so the designers of the iRobot said, why do we have to have a human being attached to the other end of this? If people really don't want to be doing this anyway, and there's a way to make it happen automatically, why wouldn't we try that? The iRobot's not perfect. You can find all kinds of videos on YouTube with it running over a pile of cat poop and it's spraying on the walls. But the point is that for many people, this was a fabulous solution, and one that you kind of go, wow, I should have thought of that before. So this is the kind of thinking that, particularly in a crisis, you want to be using to reframe problems and potential solutions. And the tool that scenario planning, our first sort of exercise, goes through leverages something called outside-in thinking. So for most of us, we live in that blue circle in the middle of the slide, right? That's your organization, your practice. And then we occasionally have to focus our efforts on the transactional environment to the next level, right? So it's paying our suppliers, it's working with our customers. We don't tend to go beyond those first two circles. Scenario planning and thinking through some of these system 2 type events requires looking at that third circle, the contextual environment. So these are shifts, and they can be, as we've seen, extremely rapid in terms of global economy and safety, technology, social change, politics, culture, and environment. And one of the things, you know, to think about too, as this current shift has happened with people spending time at home with their companion animals, is that going to fundamentally shift our relationship with them? Is the economic aspect going to trigger what we saw in 08-09 with equine ownership and a decline there? These are all things that we have some experience in the past that we can leverage, but we also need to think about maybe some new normals going forward. And as I mentioned before, the aspect of using historic data to then project into the future is not accurate. And when I grew up working in management consulting, you know, there was a lot of this. It was like, here's the linear forecast for our revenue, just add 10% or take away 10% and call it a day. And what we're finding now is it's a much more dynamic process of managing risk and growth. And prediction is very, very difficult. So for thinking about scenario planning, this is just a brief description of kind of how it works. We look at a set of future states that are directly relevant to your practice's strategy. And from those states in the future, we work backwards to figure out what should you operationally start doing, and back to the strategy question, stop doing. What it actually ends up looking like, I'll skip this for a moment, is this. So the way that you come up with this grid is you pick two factors that are at that meta level, and I'll go back to this slide, axes that are critical uncertainties in that outermost circle that you don't control: economic growth, competition, regulation. You pick two of those and then create this quadrant so that each of these represents a potentially very different world. So in this case, you can see how high economic growth in quadrant 1 with a decline in competition could really create a lot of opportunities for a practice. And you could sort of say, well, that looks like the best case scenario. Quadrant 3, where you have more competition and poor economic growth, which could very much be the reality going forward, maybe the worst case scenario. Mike, maybe I'll turn over to you for just a moment to just add a few insights in terms of how you've used this tool or things you've noticed applying this to your practice or others.
Yeah, I've noticed this in a couple of instances, both in our companion animal practice and our equine practice, and sort of looking at reframing the environment we're in. We had a companion animal practice, and we realized that in the clientele in that area where they had a lot of lap dogs, a lot of small dogs, a lot of the brachycephalic type dogs with the pushed in noses. And what we realized is that nobody in our area was doing a lot of dentistry. And so we were able to go from a number 2 dealing with these small dogs because we were worried that we weren't being able to do a lot of orthopedics repairs with them because they were so small. They're not like the bigger dogs that have hip dysplasia or cruciates or what have you. But boy, there was a lot of opportunity for dentistry growth. So just in one service, we were able to go to a number 1 because there wasn't a lot of people that had the competition for it, and yet we offered it. And I think that, we have examples in equine too of that. So I think that's where you sort of look at it, like it's that absence of what's there, or shifting what you're currently doing to fit your market.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, and this is a little more detailed in terms of how you can apply this. You can shift the timeframes around, but as Mike was saying, say you want to do something on a longer term planning basis, so 2023 or 2025, thinking about this at the meta level, like what is on the front page of the newspaper in this year? How well situated is the practice for this scenario? And then these are the 2 key things. What did you worry about right now that you actually didn't need to? And what should you have been more concerned about? Because this should drive what you start doing differently now to be successful in that future scenario. Here's a little trick. It turns out when you do this across each of the 4 scenarios, you end up having some common themes. Irrespective of which of the 4 scenarios you end up in, it often ends up that you still need to do marketing. It often ends up that you still need to do training for your team. But in some cases, you may need to just not put as much effort into, say, recruiting, or you really should probably not be investing as much into upgrading some facilities. So when you are able to do this, you can see, well, in 3 out of 4 scenarios, we really should do X. In 4 out of 4 scenarios, we should do Y. So the goal is to increase your confidence level in terms of decision-making now that can suit you well in the future. With that, Mike, I think maybe we want to launch the next poll, if you don't mind.
So that was the impact of the COVID? Is that the right one?
Yes, exactly.
All right, so I'm launching a poll. Again, it's anonymous, so please, you should be seeing it up on your screen right now. So we'll give 30 seconds again for people to click on that and get a vote, and we'll share that with everybody. Oh, we're not seeing the poll this time. Wonder why. Huh. I apologize. We're gonna have to end that one then. Sorry.
Okay. All right, no problem. We'll keep going. So last bit in terms of using sort of the scenario planning tool for help with prioritization. Back to those 2 points around what should you start and stop doing now. Ideally, that can help you bucket the work tasks that you have, both on a personal level as potentially like a practice owner or manager, or as well as prioritizing for your team. So this is a very simple sort of 4-quadrant way of thinking about the work that you have to do in terms of what's core versus not core to the business. Like, what do you need to actually do to service your clients versus non-core, which might be a system upgrade, it might be painting the walls, it might be creating a new webinar. And then what's urgent versus non. The challenge we have right now is everything feels urgent and everything feels core. And it's easy to get overwhelmed with putting all tasks into that upper right-hand bucket. I recommend this as a tool, even like on a Sunday night, laying out your schedule for the week for you as well as your team. and actually forcing yourself to put things in all 4 categories so you can see what can be dealt with later versus everything feeling like it's a house on fire to address right now. So that's tool 1. Tool 2 is something called key assumptions check. And this goes back to the biases and heuristics that Daniel Kahneman developed, which is many times we rely on assumptions to make decisions, not realizing how certain we are around that assumption. So just a moment on terminology. A fact is something that's already happened. So a fact is 100% certain. We have data, it occurred historically. We can validate that. An assumption is anything that hasn't happened. So it can't be 100% certain because we just don't have a crystal ball to see in the future. And as Mark Twain famously said, it's not what you know that we don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you do know, right? It's our feeling that assumptions are facts that cause us to make decisions that later can have blind spots and some negative consequences. So we asked previously if you had a strategy or plan written for your practice, because this is a tool that you can use against that if you have it. And it's to do the following. You make a list of all the assumptions that you have about that plan. And they can be around your business or operating model. How much revenue? We make the assumption that our revenue continues to be driven at 5%, or our customer base continues to be boomers with small animals, or our competitors will not change or grow. That the skill sets that you require will continue to be as they have been, or you have some assumptions about shifts that will occur there. So there's many different aspects you can have assumptions around, and it helps to have some bucketing or categories as you make up this list. This is a great exercise to do with your team. And you can do it collectively, or you can divide the group up where each focuses on some assumptions around each of these areas. And what it should look like is the following. You'll come up with a list, and it's a generative exercise, so you may have 15 to 20 assumptions. What you then want to do is, how certain are you, this is very subjective, by each of the assumptions. So I'm 99% certain that our customer demographic will not change in the next year, that it will hold true for our strategy or plan. Or I'm only 30% certain because I've seen a number of older people retiring and moving out of the area. And I don't know if we'll replace them as customers or if we will be actually just down in terms of revenue. When you do this as a team, what you want to do is actually collectively discuss the percent certainty you have across the group. Because what you're looking for are either areas where you have very low certainty, so it's a vulnerability, or you have disparity across the group. Someone's very confident and certain about an assumption, someone else is not. Why do we have that disparity? And the last step is, what could you do to get more data to test that assumption, either to raise the certainty and comfort, or to say, wow, this is a really vulnerable, faulty assumption. We may want to take it out of our plan. We may need to change the plan. Mike, do you want to share kind of how you've seen this play out?
So there's a couple of ones. One is more of a, people that know me, I'm a bit entrepreneurial. We've tried different things, and what I've realized after a while, and it's human nature, it's not characteristic of me, is I overestimate how good things will be of an idea of mine, and I underestimate the negative impact on that. And so I've actually gone back and looked at a couple of things that I've done, several things I've done over several years, and I always overestimate the success of something by about 20%. So whenever I'm evaluating something now, I'm always going to sit there and change. You know what? Okay, that's what I think it is. What would happen if the revenue was 20% lower? How does that affect the rest of my assumptions? And it's made me a lot wiser and not just go in there and assume that that's 100% what's happening. I think the other one too is our assumptions now as vet practices of what's going to happen with our revenue? How far is it going to drop? And if you're sitting there and you're looking at the news and you see what's happening with the airline industry, the hotel, restaurant industry, you're thinking the sky is falling and our practices will be down 50% to 100% in sales. Well, You know, there are surveys that are out. I just saw one. There's a really great company called that just sent out an email. There are 2,000 practices, and basically they're seeing in North America that sales are down 17.6%. What I'm doing is, and I'll show you if our scenario tool is, I sort of said that, you know, our sales in April, where I am in Canada, it's going to be bad because we're in lockdown right now. I'm thinking we're going to be at 20% of what we've done. Like, I took a hard line look at it. But I'm checking every day my sales this year, comparing it to the same period the year before, and checking on a day-to-day basis and a week-to-week basis. We're actually down 40%. So there's a tool that I'm now able to look at that's verifying my assumptions. My assumptions were a bit too critical, good. And now I can sit there and go, I can have better assumptions going forward with the better data that I'm getting on what we're actually doing.
Super, thank you, Mike. The last tool I want to share with you is something called a PreMortem Analysis. And this one is really, this one is really psychologically difficult if you are a practice owner, which is you want to imagine your practice totally fails a year from now. And I have had practice owners, when we've done this in sessions, say, you know, I just feel physically sick discussing this and thinking about it. My view is this is probably already something that you wake up at night worrying about. And so talking through how it could happen and then how you could avoid it happening is actually one of the best and most powerful strengthening tools that you can have for your practice. It's pretty simple how this works. And like the other two tools, it's something that's used heavily for military planning and for sort of strategic planning and risk assessment inside large organizations. So what you want to think about is a year from now, so March 2021, what happened? How did you end up deciding to either sell your practice at a loss, declare bankruptcy, or just simply shut it down? Why did that happen? And then here are the two most important parts. What were some signals that led to this disaster, right? Were you watching revenue decline month upon month? Did it turn out that your town had such a high rate of job loss that people moved away? Or in the case of equine, just were forced to sell their horses into other areas? And then the last bit is, what mitigating steps could you take to avoid a disaster? Do you flex your practice to focus on a different customer segment? Do you downsize earlier so that you're not left with a decision of keep the practice or close the practice, but just reduce the size? Do you expand your coverage to multi-species so that you are able to buffer against some of the areas that may be harder hit? So these are just some of the things to think about, and it creates a really important discussion too with your practice, because key to all of this is the speed at which you respond and the skills and the resources that you have versus maybe need to acquire to be successful. So Mike, for this last one, I'll just hand back to you if anything you want to share in terms of kind of usage of this or things that you've observed.
Yeah, I love this one, and I wish I knew it. I wish I had met you 10 years ago, because boy, I have done some things with our business that if I had had this, it would have made me really look at things more clinically and more objectively. And I think as veterinarians, that's what we look for. We look at, you know, blood results, you know, cytology results, pathology results. I mean, we look at a lot of testing, and I sort of try to shift my focus of thinking not like a vet. Well, thinking as a business person is very similar as being a diagnostician of examining an animal. So I think these same things here, if you look at it, if you can see a dog or a cat or a horse, and we all have these patients, we're like, boy, if the client doesn't do something now, this animal is going to be in big trouble in a year. And I think those are the same lenses that we have to look at our business, that if, you know, we don't do this now, we're spending too much money on that. We have too many employees right now. We don't want to get rid of people because we like them too much. We're counting on one source of revenue. There are all of these things that I'm sure with all the different businesses that are attending here, that we can all sort of find things in our business and go, you know, either, you know, if there's a problem, get rid of it, or is there an opportunity to use whatever excess capacity or whatever we're doing and use that as a strength? So I think this is a great tool.
Super. So with that, I want to make sure we have time to talk a little more in depth about other opportunities and tools that we have for you. So Mike, I don't know if there are any other questions that have come in, but if not, I can stop my screen share and hand back over to you.
Sure. So what I wanted to do, and some of you who were on the one last week saw this, but I will show you a tool that we are about to introduce. Where is it? There you go. This is a tool that we have put together. We are fine-tuning it, and I expect by the end of the week we'll have it out to release. And so what it is, and this is just a very basic version of it, and what this shows is on my screen here is you're seeing an Excel sheet. And I'm going to look at the questions in case somebody says, Mike, we don't see an Excel sheet.
So I am seeing it, but I'm wondering if
if you're seeing it, it's there then. So
okay.
So basically, what we have, these are, and this is a more of a high-level version of. We have a couple of things. We have revenue, and so right now, as veterinarians, what's going on with the COVID right now? We're going, well, our revenue is going to fall off. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. We have our cost of goods, which are our medications, our supplies. And then we have payroll. Payroll is our biggest expense, followed by cost of goods, and then we have fixed costs. So in this example here, and these are just some representative numbers, our budget was we were going to have sales of 250,000, but if we're only going to do 80% of revenue, we're going to have 200,000. And then going through it and just saying, so this could be a very typical clinic right now where sales are down almost 20%, but we're keeping it at full staffing, and we haven't looked at any of our fixed costs to go that we could miss, we could trim them. So what it tells me is at the end of this month of April, if I carried on like this and these revenue assumptions of 80% and we kept everything else together, we would only have net income of about 2,500 as opposed to 40,000 we would have had if we had 100% revenue. But we also have to add in that we have some cash expenses. These are bank loans, typically equipment loans that we have that we won't see on our income statement. So if we look at this, and let's just say, for example, we had 5,000, our after cash profit is actually not 35,000, but it's minus 2,500. So, okay, so knowing those three scenario planning tools, what do we need to do? Can I shift payroll down a little bit? Can we go down to 80% payroll? Let's see what would happen there just to match it. And I think I could probably take about 2% off my, my fixed costs. Well, boy, just doing that, all of a sudden we have a surplus of 18,500. So there's about a $20,000 gap by looking at some things that we can do with our payroll. We can play around with things and say, you know what, I just love my people. I can't get rid of them. All right, well, we're going to lose a bit of money, but is there a way of being much better at how we're buying? Instead of buying in a lot of special orders and bringing them in, we tell people, you know what, we'll order it in, we'll have it for you tomorrow. We're not going to have so much on the shelves. So if I just lower my cost of goods by 3%, wow, I can keep everybody employed. But if I lower my cost of goods by 3%, I'm actually in a profit. So I've gone from about under 2,500 down to about 4,500 above, about a $7,000 spread. So little changes make a huge difference. If all of a sudden you're going along and you're checking things, you're like, you know what, 80% isn't what I'm doing. I'm going down to 70%. Then you're like, there's just, you know what, I have to start looking at some of my people. I've got to start looking at cutting costs because there's just no way I'm going to be able to carry on this way. And from keeping my cost of goods down a bit and cutting some payroll costs, I'm back in a profitable position again. I'm just going to show people what this looks like full out. I'm not going to share too much of it because this is what I presented to my bank, actually myself, last week. And the reason why I thought this is something we've got to offer it is because I looked at this, I showed it to him, and he said, this is the best scenario planning tool on data that I've ever seen. And he was able to come back to me. He said, it's going to take me about a week to go to my above people, my bosses, to get approval. He came back to me 2 days later and he said, the spreadsheet helped. Here, we're going to defer in principal loan payments for the next 6 months. And they gave us a substantial boost in our line of credit. So financially, I'm feeling pretty good. And what I've been able to do is I said, okay, April, you know what? I started off at 20% of revenue, but now that I'm tracking it, I'm thinking 50% is fair. You know, the payroll is really low. It's because we've introduced something in Canada where the government is subsidizing 75% of payroll up to $58,000. So about 40%, we're on the hook for about 40% of the payroll. May, I think our sales will go up. I'm hoping if we can flatten the curve enough in April that doors start opening and our clients are out. We'll still have that reduced payroll, but sales will be up. June, I think our sales will be at 80%, but we're going to lose that boost in payroll because they're only doing it for businesses that have lost 30% of sales. So we might be actually tighter in June. But what I have been able to do is combine it and say, you know what? If my projections work out at the end of this quarter, I'm going to have a surplus of $40,000. You know, so going into this COVID crisis, and no, we're not going into it, we're in the midst of it now. I'm feeling pretty good about how we're going to do financially. And this is a great tool that I can go and look at it month to month and go, this is fine. We can stretch it out to August, July, August, September, you know, depending on how long it's going to last. I think geographically, we all know it has an impact on different areas. So this is a tool that Oculus is going to start promoting and making available. It's going to go in 3 parts. The first part is, it's going to stop sharing. The first part, it'll be much like the questions and the scenario planning exercises that Whitney had. So there'd be a bunch of questions you fill out online. The second part is, and this is why we're just delayed a couple of days of releasing this right now, is just getting the right system to transfer financial information and to have the right confidentiality agreement. So there'll be some select financial information that we will use, create into our master scenario planning tool. And then the third step is a 1-hour consult with myself or Whitney or somebody else within Oculus to say, here's what we've seen, here's the scenario, here are our suggestions for what you need to do for the next 3 months, maybe the next 6 months. Based on some of the questions that you've answered, we'll have a better idea to say, you know, what this is part of your long-term strategy. Maybe you're not gonna be able to do it next year, but maybe in 2 years you can do it. So basically, giving you the information, challenge your assumptions, challenge your biases, and have a more accurate outlook of where your business is going and give some certainty into a time of a lot of uncertainty. So if anybody has any questions on that, and I will say the price that we're going to be selling that for is $475 American or euros. And so if anybody has any questions or thoughts, I'm hoping to be able to release it later this week. We're just cutting those final last technological things that we just want to make sure that it's safe and secure for everybody. So I'm just looking, no questions. I guess you've answered all the questions. Anybody else have anything they want to add? We have a few more minutes. Otherwise, what we'll be doing is sending out some of these exercises in advance. I'll give you guys a sneak preview of that scenario planning. And I think next Tuesday, we're having another webinar, and it's going to be on leadership in times of crisis. Our speaker is Rob Karam. He's from the Netherlands, outstanding speaker. We have had him at sessions in Europe and North America, and like Whitney, he's one of our highest rated speakers. And so he's gladly coming on board and teaching some skills that as leaders of our vet practices, how can we be better leaders in these challenging times? This will be up probably by in a couple of hours, posted online if everybody wants to go back and review any parts of this. and we will put together some of these scenarios to send for you. So you've got the benefit of attending live. You're going to get the actual course material. So thank you, Whitney. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody else for attending.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone.